the very act of pausing before you start something is going to give you dynorphins. We've all felt the pull of a task. So like right when you're sitting down to work, we just want the satisfaction of progress. That's the outcome that is alluring us. And I think that's cheap dopamine. So it's much better to learn to pause before you start something and put order in it.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at optimwork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at optimwork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif, here with another episode of the Optimal Work podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majeres. Kevin, good to be back here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. Well, I thought, we're going to do another episode on dynorphins. And so I thought maybe we could just start with a brief recap of last week's episode to help ease people back into this one.
Great. Yeah, dynorphins are really a fundamental aspect of our experience because they are what essentially make us suffer. So suffering can be thought of as pain plus unwillingness. But you could also just say that really that means discomfort plus dynorphins. So what really makes us suffer is the dynorphins attached to discomfort. But the good news is that dynorphins are under voluntary control. That is, if you are willing to experience them, you can reprogram them because you will quickly lose the dynorphin tag for anything you are willing to experience. So we also talked about ways of practicing willingness, of being welcoming and savoring the discomfort, even loving it. So if you can think of finding a dial inside of you on willingness, and every time you experience the dynorphins, to try turning that dial all the way up, that is actually the path of the most radical growth.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like, is this basically patience? Kind of. I mean, because when you talked about the dial, it reminded me of something you often say of like patience drinks in impatience. That image just...
Impatience is like wine and patience drinks it. And the impatience is actually the dynorphins. And that's why the thing that gets them most associated with something is when you have tried to fix it and been unable to, or you have tried to escape it and have been unable to. That kind of thwarted escape is most sensitizing.
So this sounds big because it sounds like it would be then involved in every area where you're trying to, do behavioral change or grow or start a new habit or stop an old habit because we only grow through challenges. And so every time there's a challenge, it's something that's just beyond our current abilities. And so it's going to be something that, presents some kind of difficulty that we might be unwilling in some way to experience. So it sounds like dynorphins and embracing dynorphins, being willing to experience the dynorphin effect is just going to be like part of every aspect of our growth.
Yeah, that's right. Because as I've often said, that the only thing we complain about are challenges. Yet challenges are the only way we grow. More literally at the neurochemical level, those things that we complain about are the things that cause us to feel the dynorphin effect. So, and yet those are precisely the areas where our growth most lies. And in some ways, this all goes back to the amygdala. And I love the amygdala, and because it has such a clear role in anxiety, in anxiety, we talk about how the amygdala is there to detect threats and sound the alarm. But you can say it has a much more general kind of function, which is your amygdala really is about detecting triggers and then signaling discomfort. So the detecting triggers means anything that you've sensitized yourself to. So anything you're unwilling to experience can become then a trigger for your amygdala to be on the lookout for so that you can become more aware of it. And then it allows you to notice it more when that thing does come. And that's the whole thalamic gating we were talking about. All that's tied in with the amygdala and dynorphins. And so your amygdala has two different levers that it can operate. One uses your hypothalamus, and that's what gives you adrenaline. And the other doesn't. It actually is the amygdala itself has this lever, and that's what gives you dynorphins. And so you can have one without the other. So you could have, let's say, a person who loves roller coasters, but hates the feeling of anxiety in almost every situation. What that means is that when that person's in the roller coaster scenario, the thrill is still there, and so the amygdala is actually triggering the adrenaline, and for it to be released. But the dynorphins aren't there at all, so the whole experience is enjoyable. So many people with anxiety find that in certain circumstances, they can actually enjoy those feelings. So it just depends on when the amygdala is also moving that dynorphin lever. But on the other hand, you can also, let's say there's something that is not a threat, but that's kind of aversive. My example would be, sometimes those annoying ads if you're watching a movie streaming, and then you thought you paid for it, but then there's this ad in the middle that you can't fast forward. Okay, now clearly it's not a threat, and I don't get any immediate adrenaline from it, but it's very aversive. So there's very high dynorphins, which also means that because dynorphins have one of their functions is to totally suppress dopamine, I think it means I'm actually going to be much less likely to buy those things that are in those advertisements. But just to say, these are two different systems that all go back to the amygdala.
This is, I don't know, maybe not a super practical question, but when we talk about the amygdala and the adrenaline response and fuels the fight or flight response, adrenaline fuels fight or flight, but we also I think you also talk about that there's a third possible reaction, which is the freeze reaction. Mm-hmm. So it's really like fight, flight, or freeze. Is right. The freeze that when there's no hypothalamus, no adrenaline, but it's just the dynorphins, would that be freeze, or is there a lot of adrenaline in the freeze reaction too?
Is probably still, I believe it's still hypothalamically mediated, but it goes through, because it's using your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system together. So you're in like a terror state, which you usually associate with sympathetics, but then you have a parasympathetic-like response, which is a drop in heart rate and a total freezing. So it's a combined kind of state that you have then. And if you can then resolve the freeze state, you actually would have the person then go into fight or flight, and they would experience this huge anxiety when the freeze resolves. So it's kind of like the parasympathetics have a brake that they can put on top of everything. So and I think that's a different mechanism. Undoubtedly, there's dynorphins there too. So in these things, you would expect that you would be unwilling for whatever the really awful thing is happening to happen. So that you would have both.
Kevin, I guess the next thing maybe that we could bring into the picture, which you had alluded to briefly, was how dopamines interact with this system of the amygdala and the dynorphins. Unless, I don't know if there's anything else we needed to bring in as kind of the groundwork for this.
No, I think that if you look at then what happens when you have very high dynorphins, one of the things it's doing is completely suppressing dopamine. Okay, so think about what that would mean for a person who typically procrastinates on things. So when a daunting task presents itself and they're really unwilling to start engaging it, and they have a lot of dynorphins about beginning, that very fact that they have dynorphins about starting suppresses their dopamine and makes it even harder to start. So it's a curious thing, right? That if you have a high dynorphin signal, your ability to engage the challenge is in that moment kind of suppressed so that you can avoid it. Then question, how do you turn it around? Well, and this is the beauty of the opponent process. The moment you welcome the pain of the discomfort of starting that new task, you locate it and you welcome it, you lean into it. That pushing up on the dynorphins, it's like it flips a switch in you. And this is what is under voluntary control. You can always be willing to experience whatever is triggering the dynorphins. You don't have to be unwilling. Whether you're willing or unwilling is literally the only thing under purely voluntary control, because it's the state of your will. So if you flip that switch in your willingness and like, wait a second, I'm just going to embrace this discomfort fully, that's going to give you a dopamine rebound. So that whatever you engage next is going to start to become more and more rewarding. And that's even more powerful if you practice some new kind of approach or skill in that very thing you were avoiding. So if a person, let's say, never spoke up in public, and was afraid to, but say they're in a lecture and they have a really interesting question and they're afraid of asking it. They hate feeling afraid in front of other people. So they have very high dynorphins. But let's say they say, you know what, I'm just going to let myself embrace this discomfort and ask the question. What would happen is they would get a large bolus of dopamine after they ask the question. And they're also practicing a new skill of asking questions in class, something that they'll get better at. And so they're going to get better and better at asking questions, and it's going to get easier and easier. In fact, the dopamine they get, because your brain knows in some way that when you embrace the discomfort and then engage something, you're practicing a new skill that should be remembered. And that's why you need dopamine. Dopamine is there to help you remember the new skill you're practicing. And that kind of is like all of behavioral change in a nutshell. You lean into the discomfort and then you ride the dopamine wave that's going to carry you through with more energy and motivation in the task that comes. So with procrastination, if people are feeling a lot of resistance to starting, and then, you know what, I'm just going to feel it, I'm going to welcome it, savor it, love it, and then I'm going to break down the first step into even smaller steps. And they do that, and now it feels easy to get started, and they start to do the transition from high dynorphin to high dopamine.
It sounds like dynorphins are very powerful. So when you're about to start something and you get this, the feeling of dynorphins, like, I can't do this. I just can't do this right now. Mm-hmm. That's a signal to you that, hey, whatever my next action is going to become a habit.
Exactly.
I mean, whatever I do next is really important.
Yes. And the more unwilling you feel, the higher your dynorphin level, the greater bounce of the dopamine rebound. It's called dopamine rebound excitation. But it's what happens when you voluntarily embrace discomfort and then start engaging the challenge. Your brain is going to now be remembering how to engage this challenge in the future because it's how you do it this one time. The next time you won't get as much of a dynorphin surge, but you'll still get some, and then you'll still get a dopamine rebound. So really, we want to be chasing dynorphins. We want to be learning how to lean into that, because that's what gives us then the most constant energy and motivation.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support. Yeah, so you mentioned the amygdala. So we've talked about in the past a lot, threat learning, safety learning. Yeah. And, safety learning is obviously when your amygdala is treating something as a threat, and then you approach it, and then you're teaching your amygdala, actually, this thing is safe. Threat learning is when you avoid it, and then you're teaching your amygdala that, yes, this is a threat. So the more dynorphins are present there, the greater the magnitude of the threat learning or the safety learning.
So, okay, there's two separate things. One is that if you have something that is that you've been avoiding that is now increasingly threatening, you avoided it because your alarm is sounding, which means in the midst of adrenaline, you use the adrenaline to flee. So that's the prime case of threat learning. So in that case, you also are going to have a dynorphin signal for what you're avoiding. And so you have both threat learning and the dynorphin sensitization. The more general way, though, you can describe what your amygdala is doing that just makes it easier is just think of it as sensitizing or desensitizing a trigger. Because that can include the threat label changing, or it can simply change how much dynorphin signal is generated when that thing comes. So that any kind of safety learning you're doing is probably simultaneously desensitizing dynorphins. So the more general case, though, even if it's not about getting like a lot of adrenaline because you're anxious, the deeper thing is that resistance you felt to doing something. The resistance you felt to doing something you thought would be best for you to do. So like take as an example, like what if a person is a people pleaser and someone, their boss asked them to take care of something at the last minute because they forgot about it themselves and then puts it on their plate. Well, now the people pleaser knows that they really should push back and have a boundary and politely say that they're unable to do it. But they don't want to feel the tension of conflict. They don't want to feel the possible, anger or rejection coming at them. So instead, then they say yes and they give in. They get some momentary relief, right, from the tension, but now they know that it's even hard. It's going to be harder next time. They keep sensitizing themselves, by missing the opportunities to break the habit of people pleasing. Now, that also just would say that this gets to another aspect of dopamine, that dopamine is involved in all learning. So what happens then if a person keeps agreeing when they shouldn't agree with others or apologizing when they really don't need to apologize? Well, every time they do that, they get a little bit of relief because they've escaped the pain of the tension. Okay. Relief also triggers dopamine. So when you experience relief, you get a momentary burst of endorphins, which make it feel good, and dopamine. And so relief is very rewarding, meaning it really it kind of hijacks your dopamine system and uses it to learn all the wrong lessons. Relief is what drives vicious cycles. So that's why when people act on negative emotions is to get relief from them. And that only makes them remember the behaviors they did to get relief even more deeply. Those behaviors are reinforced. That's all dopamine mediated. But the result of that temporary dopamine and endorphin boost is those are going to go away once the learning has been done, and you're going to have a more long-lasting wave of dynorphins, partly because you didn't do the right thing. And that it's now you have more things hanging over you. Just like procrastinating. You put something off, now it just hangs over you. But anytime you deliberately kind of seek relief from dynorphins, or you try to push up on endorphins in unhealthy ways, like with substances, you risk getting this long-lasting wave of dynorphin baseline going higher and higher. And then you feel more generally depressed and anxious and malaise.
Mm-hmm. So this is the opponent process idea, which you mentioned briefly earlier, and we've done episodes about in the past of that. When your dynorphins go down, after that, your endorphins and your dopamine goes up, and that's what solidifies the habit.
Exactly. And so, if you're in something that's very aversive and you successfully escape it, you are going to feel relief, which is endorphins, and then that also brings with it dopamine, and that's going to make you remember the relieving behavior more strongly. But usually those are all the ways that we avoid challenges. If you push up on dynorphins deliberately and welcome it, that's a much healthier way of, now the dynorphin wave on its own can be desensitized. And then you get this long-lasting boost of dopamine and endorphins.
Now, so if relief kind of causes the dopamine, or it is the dopamine being
Yeah.
released.
The
after
relief is the mix of endorphins and dopamine.
endorphins. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but you get that same mix. Even like if you had pushed up on the dynorphins,
Yeah.
then you get the subsequent increase in dopamine, but you don't feel that as relief necessarily. Or?
No, you don't. You feel it actually as energy, and as a positive mood. It has to do also with the fact that the greater the relief, like what you're experiencing there is essentially short-term gain. And that is going to lead you with long-term pain. But when you embrace dynorphins, like by welcoming the discomfort of saying politely no to someone, or welcoming the discomfort of starting a daunting task, that is actually totally embracing the short-term pain, but it gives you long-term gain. It's also interesting that when it comes to tasks, there is this MIT researcher, Graybiel, who found that initially you get more dopamine at the end of a task, which is when you get the outcome. You finished it. So the sense of completion, you get some dopamine. But the more you've mastered the task, with increasing mastery, the dopamine happens earlier and earlier and earlier, to eventually happens just as you even initiate the task. So we find that doing tasks that we've mastered is a way of actually getting the dopamine earlier in the task, which is interesting.
Yeah, and does that have to do with? I know a lot of people, think that you get the dopamine hit. There's this common phrase, dopamine hit. I don't know how used that is in the psychological literature, but or neuroscience. But you get the dopamine hit when you do the thing, when you get the social media post or the likes on your post or whatever it is. But then other research is suggesting that you get the dopamine in anticipation of, going on the social media site or watching the video or whatever the distraction is. So you kind of get the dopamine at either time, depending on how solidified the habit is. Is that the idea?
Well, yeah, and I think that if any kind of positive reinforcement is going to give you dopamine. So if someone compliments you, great, then that gets something. Someone likes your post, great, you get a little bit of dopamine. And it's also true that as you make progress towards completing something, then you get dopamine as you make progress. And the more you've mastered something, the more you start to feel like, now that I've gotten traction in this task, it's almost like your brain is anticipating that this is already like a win, and you get more as you make progress all along the way, you continually get dopamine. This is why we want people to ultimately not work for outcomes, but for process goals, things where they can get better and better and better in an unlimited way, because then that gives you more endless dopamine. So, and this is where if we can identify the pain that holds us back and then welcome it, we enter into then this new area where we can make real growth. There is some skill that will help us engage this challenge in a concrete and better way. And that skill also has there's some ideal that can enliven that skill. So we can start to connect these challenges with skills and ideals, which are going to give us long-lasting dopamine.
Yeah. I was recently talking to someone about, the ideals process versus outcomes in work. And, one thing I think that can happen when people are working is that if they aren't seeing the outcome that they want, like maybe they're writing a paper and they're just not seeing the progress that they want toward the end goal, they get frustrated, and that leads them to double down on their old strategies, their old way of doing things. So is there something about dynorphins that kind of pushes you into the automated track a little bit? If you're unwilling to experience them, you just get that little relief from going back to your old strategy that maybe didn't work so well, but at least you're familiar with it?
Well, I think that the very act of pausing before you start something is going to give you dynorphins. So we've all felt the pull of a task. So right when you're sitting down to work, we just want the satisfaction of progress. And I think that always is that's the outcome that is alluring us. And I think that's cheap dopamine. So it's much better to learn to pause before you start something and put order in it. Isn't the very act of putting order into something, breaking it into smaller steps, isn't that already the embracing of dynorphins? It's always, order is a constant source of dynorphins. Think about cleaning a room. Isn't it always a little bit painful to clean a room and to put order into things? It's like just the act of putting order into things means not doing the quick thing, the most efficient thing, but it means doing something that is deliberate and intelligent, and you have to think before you act. So it's interesting that I think order always gives us dynorphins, but then so does intensity. So to be totally engaged with the task, there's always going to be an element there. We recoil from it in advance. If we know a task is going to require 100% intensity, it's easier to put it off. That's probably what we're procrastinating. Procrastination is forgetting that there's order, which could break things down and make them easy, and just thinking of intensity and feeling daunted by it. So giving a task our whole, and constancy, completely dynorphin generating. So order, intensity, constancy, all work involves the embracing of dynorphins. So I actually think the number one practice for welcoming dynorphins is the golden hour. If you can pause before you start something, think of how you're going to stretch yourself in it and doing it in a new and better way. Well, that stretch, which is what accompanies all growth, that stretch is dynorphin mediated. That's what makes it stretching. That's why we are never at the point where we can live without embracing dynorphins. We're never at a point where an ideal doesn't require, in some way, further sacrifice and the embracing of the discomfort in order to be made real.
I love it. I love it. Kevin, I just have one question for you. Mm-hmm. I was very surprised that you brought in order, intensity, constancy. And so I was impressed. So my last question is, when we talk about adrenaline, there's a sense that anxiety is the experience of adrenaline without engaging the challenge, with like an unwillingness.
It's
so unused
yeah.
Adrenaline. But then once you reframe the adrenaline as this is here to help me perform at my best, adrenaline becomes like a superpower where we have higher IQ, fluency, better memory, all this stuff. So
exactly.
Is there a sense of that with dynorphins that, okay, oh no, here are the dynorphins again. Here's that discomfort. Here's that reluctance. Can you, in the same way that you can reframe the adrenaline itself from nervousness to, better performance, can you do the same with dynorphins? Like, oh, here's that reluctance again. Oh, but it will help me do X. What would that be?
The resistance that we experience is always the ticket to growth. There's something there that we can be welcoming. And this also gets to the idea that when you're thinking of putting love into something and lovingly embracing a difficulty, right? It's somehow these things that are challenging are better channels or receptacles of love than things that are easy. So it's actually easier to put your whole heart into doing something that is harder and that has this dynorphin aspect to it. And it seems to me that one of the kind of transformations that can occur, the more we try to pass love through dynorphins. So you just think of anything as a sacrifice, and then find a motive of love and try to put love into the very discomfort itself. That the whole thing actually starts to more and more become love. And what was a sacrifice now is just a way of loving, and it becomes easy. So in the end, love is what makes all things easy. And when you really love something, eventually, in fact, the dynorphins do go away. But then you can always find another way of challenging yourself. There's always some new horizon. There's always some new, even whole new vistas that can open up, and you realize the ways of challenging yourself. But it's not because we hate dynorphins, want to conquer them. It's more like they're actually the main way that we can grow and love and serve.
Well, that's great. That's great, Kevin. I think that's the perfect note for us to end on here today.
All right, Sharif. Great. Thanks for your questions.
Awesome. All right. We'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out optimalwork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.